You find yourself hiding behind silk curtains in the Forbidden City, listening to the faint sound of a silk ribbon being pulled tight around a young emperor's neck. It's 1542 AD, and 16 palace women move like shadows through Emperor Jimjing's bedchamber. Their bare feet make no sound on the cold marble as they surround the sleeping ruler. One girl, only 14, shakes as she pulls the curtain cord tighter. Her hands tremble because she knows this moment means freedom or death. There is no middle ground in the Chinese Imperial Harem. The ribbon catches. Their knot is wrong. The emperor stirs. In moments, these women will face death by 1,000 cuts. But tonight, they dared to strike back against a system that treated them like animals for the emperor's immortality. Before diving into these lost stories of survival and pain, if you enjoy learning about the hidden sides of history, consider pressing that like button and subscribing for more. And please leave a comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it amazing that we can explore these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected through time and space by our shared curiosity for the past. Imagine walking through the red walls and golden roofs of the Forbidden City. Tourists today see beauty, majesty, and great architecture. They don't see the thousands of women who lived and died inside these walls, never to see their families again, never able to choose their own path. For over 2,000 years, from the Qin dynasty in 2021 BC through the fall of the Qing in 1912 AD, Chinese emperors kept harems that could hold up to 20,000 women at once. The ranks of imperial consorts shifted over time, but always mattered in running the inner court and in imperial succession. All women inside the Forbidden City were locked away in the imperial quarters deep in the palace. They were confined to the inner court and forbidden from leaving the northern section. The selection process was harsh and wide-reaching. In the Ming dynasty, for example, no family was safe from it. By law, all young unmarried girls had to go through the Shunu selection process. This process took place inside the Forbidden City every 3 years. Candidates were usually 14 to 16 years old, and were picked based on their family morals, behavior, character, looks, and health. Every 3 years, officials swept across the empire, looking for girls aged 14 to 16. Beauty was less important than bloodline and virtue. But once chosen, these girls vanished into the palace forever. The very buildings were built to keep them. The inner court was divided into 3 main groups of women: concubines, palace maids, and royal princesses. They lived under a strict hierarchy that could raise or destroy them depending on the emperor's mood. At the top was the empress, the emperor's only official wife. She was the most honored and respected woman in China, seen as the mother of the world. Imagine being one of those chosen girls taken from everything familiar at 14. You've never traveled more than a few miles from your village, never seen buildings taller than 2 floors, never touched silk. Now you walk through gates wide enough for armies, down halls longer than your whole town, past walls painted with dragons and phoenixes that seem to watch every step. The air smells strange here, incense mixed with fear and the metallic scent of power. You hear the rustling of thousands of silk robes, whispers in languages you don't know, and the muffled crying of someone trying not to be heard. The harem wasn't just a group of beautiful women. It was a controlled system of fear and abuse. To make sure any child born in the harem was the emperor's, men were banned from serving the women. The only exception was eunuchs, men who had been castrated so they couldn't father children. During the Ming dynasty, from 1368 to 1644, there were nearly 100,000 eunuchs serving the emperor and his harem. These weren't willing servants. Boys as young as 8 were forced to undergo castration, and many died from it. In China, the procedure wasn't just removing the penis, it also included the scrotum. This left many suffering from incontinence, a foul smell, and being shunned by other men who despised them. Picture an 8-year-old boy dragged from his family, pinned down by adults as a knife takes away his manhood forever. Fewer than 60% survived. Those who did faced a lifetime of pain, social rejection, and deep trauma. They were neither fully male nor female in a world that only saw those two roles. They belonged nowhere except in service to the same rulers who destroyed them. To ensure loyalty, the emperor's knights with concubines followed a strict order. Secretaries kept records of his sex life with brushes dipped in red ink. Even private moments were reduced to paperwork. Concubines had to bathe and be checked by court doctors before the emperor visited them. Imagine being reduced to a line in an official book, your most private moments written down by men with ink and brushes. Daily life for concubines was filled with constant surveillance. Of course, they were strictly forbidden from being with anyone except the emperor. Most of their lives were watched and controlled by eunuchs, who held great power in the palace. It was believed that organizing the emperor's sex life was essential to maintaining the well-being of the entire Chinese empire. The Chinese calendars of the 10th century were not used to keep track of time, but rather to keep the emperor's sex schedule in check. For many women in the harem, the horror began before they even entered the palace walls. Since the barbaric practice of foot-binding was prominent at this time, the hobbled women could not run away or even walk into the emperor's bedchambers, but instead had to be carried naked to the expectant man. Foot-binding involved breaking the bones in a girl's feet and folding them under to create the desired lotus bud shape. The process began when girls were as young as 4 years old before their bones hardened. Mothers would wrap their daughters' feet so tightly that the blood supply was cut off, causing the toes to rot and fall off. The arch was broken and the foot folded in half. The smell of rotting flesh was considered a sign that the binding was working properly. Listen to the sound of small bones snapping under pressure. Picture a mother holding down her screaming 4-year-old daughter while wrapping cloth around feet that will never again carry her freely across a field or up a hillside. The little girl doesn't understand why her mother is hurting her, why the pain goes on for months, why walking becomes agony. She only knows that love now comes with torture, that the people who are supposed to protect her are the ones causing her pain. This wasn't just about beauty standard. It was about control. Women with bound feet couldn't walk more than a few steps without severe pain. They couldn't run, couldn't defend themselves, couldn't escape. They became completely dependent on others for mobility. In the harem, this physical helplessness became another tool of imprisonment. A woman with bound feet could never run away even if she somehow escaped the palace walls. She would be recaptured within hours, hobbling painfully through streets she couldn't navigate, dependent on the mercy of strangers who would likely turn her over to authorities for the reward. Of all the horrors documented in Chinese imperial history, perhaps none surpassed those of Emperor Jiajing, who ruled from 50. According to some sources, the emperor's search for immortality involved collecting the menstrual blood of female virgins and using it to make a substance called red lead, which he consumed. The Jiajing emperor kept girls around the age of 13 and fed them only mulberry leaves and rainwater to ensure the purity of their menstrual blood. Any of the girls who became sick were beaten or sometimes thrown out. Numerous girls aged 13 to 14 were kept for the production of this vile concoction and were fed only mulberry leaves and rainwater, as the emperor believed this would keep his substance pure. Picture rows of 13-year-old girls, their bodies just beginning to develop, locked in chambers and fed like laboratory animals. As part of the girls' daily life, they woke early and collected dew from the garden's banana trees, taking it to the Jiajing emperor to drink. Another of his methods for longevity. Many of the girls fell ill from cold and were punished for becoming sick. Their diet of mulberry leaves and rainwater wasn't enough to sustain growing bodies, but malnutrition was part of the process. Weak, sick girls were easier to control, and their desperation made them compliant. The collection process itself was mechanized horror. Each month during their menstrual cycles, these girls were examined and their blood collected by eunuchs and court physicians. They were treated like livestock being milked, their natural bodily functions harvested for an emperor's delusional pursuit of immortality. The girls who produced the most blood received slightly better treatment. Those whose cycles were irregular or insufficient were beaten or discarded entirely. The emperor's obsession with immortality consumed hundreds of young lives. A few years later, in 1552, he lowered the age and brought in 28 girls. 3 years later, in 1555, he brought in an additional 50 girls under 8 years old, all for making more of his red lead elixir. 8-year-olds, children who should have been playing with dolls or learning to read, were instead imprisoned in the Forbidden City, their prepubescent bodies monitored for signs of sexual development. The emperor was literally waiting for children to reach puberty, so he could harvest their menstrual blood. Guards watched these little girls for physical changes, noting when their bodies began to develop, preparing them for a future of systematic bleeding for an emperor's impossible dream. What made this even more grotesque was the emperor's complete withdrawal from governing. Following the attempt on Jiajing's life, the emperor withdrew to the western part of the Forbidden City, where he lived in isolation and stopped holding court for the next 2 decades of his reign. While his empire crumbled and his people suffered famines and invasions, Jiajing focused entirely on his twisted pursuit of eternal life, feeding on the blood of children. The Renyian plot of 1542 AD was the moment when some of these palace women finally reached their breaking point. The Renyian plot took place in 1542 and involved 16 palace women who tried to take the life of Jiajing. Picture these women in the emperor's bedchamber that night. The palace women took action on a night that the emperor spent in the chambers of his favorite concubine, the consort Duan, known also as Lady Cao. After the concubine withdrew with her attendants, the emperor was left alone and the palace women took the opportunity to attack. They had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. 16 women coordinating in secret, knowing that discovery meant not just death, but the torture of their families. They had to communicate through glances and gestures, through coded conversations about silk and poetry that actually concerned murder and freedom. They practiced tying knots in darkness, tested the strength of curtain cords, discussed who would hold the emperor down and who would pull the noose tight. The women held down the emperor while one concubine tried to strangle him with a ribbon from her hair. When this failed, they tied a silk curtain cord around his neck, but unfortunately tied the wrong kind of knot and were not able to tighten the noose to finish the job. Imagine that moment of desperate action. 16 women, some barely out of childhood, surrounding the most powerful man in their world. Their hands are shaking. One girl is crying silently as she holds down the emperor's arm. Another is whispering prayers or curses under her breath. The woman with the ribbon from her hair, picture her. She's probably 19 or 20, has been in the palace for 5 years, has seen friends disappear into the emperor's chambers and emerge broken or not at all. This ribbon has been in her hair since she was selected for the harem. It's from her mother, the last thing connecting her to home. Now she's using it to try to strangle her captor. But their inexperience betrayed them. These were women trained in music and poetry, not assassins. They didn't know how to tie a proper strangling knot. They hesitated at crucial moments. When the emperor began to struggle, some of them froze. Their failure sealed their doom. One of the conspirators panicked and reported the assassination attempt to Empress Fang. As the emperor was unconscious till the next afternoon, the empress took matters into her own hands and tragically had the palace women executed by slow slicing, known also as death by 1,000 cuts. The families of these women were also executed. Death by 1,000 cuts was designed to maximize suffering. Some records during the Ming dynasty show that this might be around 3,000 incisions over 3 days or so. Sometimes the flesh of victims was also sold as medicine. The executioners were skilled craftsmen of pain, trained to keep victims conscious and alive for as long as possible. They would start with small cuts on the extremities, gradually working toward vital organs, timing each incision to prolong the agony. Picture the 16 women being dragged to the execution ground. Some are praying, some are screaming, some have gone silent with terror. The youngest might be 15 years old. She's never been outside the palace walls, never kissed a boy she chose, never had the chance to become a mother or learn a trade or travel to another city. Now she's being strapped to a wooden frame while men with knives discuss the best way to make her death last for days. In addition to the girls being killed by knives, Empress Fang ordered 10 of their family members beheaded and 20 other family members enslaved. Mothers and fathers who had lost their daughters to the Imperial Harem now lost their lives for their daughters' desperate attempt at freedom. Siblings were sold into slavery. Entire family lines were wiped out because 16 girls tried to strangle the emperor who was farming them for their blood. The most chilling aspect of this story is what it reveals about desperation. These women knew the consequences of failure, yet they still tried. They chose certain death over continued existence in Chinese harem. What does that tell us about the conditions they endured daily? What kind of systematic horror would make teenage girls decide that death by torture was preferable to life in the palace? Consider what these women experienced every day that made them willing to die, rather than continue living it. They watched friends disappear into the emperor's laboratories. They saw girls their own age weakening from malnutrition, their bodies harvested like crops. They lived knowing that they were nothing more than blood-producing machinery for a madman's delusions of immortality. Death by 1,000 cuts was horrific, but at least it would end. Life in Chinese harem was death by 1,000 cuts spread out over years. The emperor's response to the assassination attempt revealed his complete detachment from reality and humanity. So what did the Chinese emperor do in the aftermath of the assassination attempt? He tightened up restrictions on his virgins and brought in 300 new girls. After Empress Fang died in 1547, 16 women had just died agonizing deaths trying to escape his system, and his response was to make the system even more restrictive and bring in more victims. Fast forward to 1900 AD, and we encounter another story that reveals the casual brutality that defined life in the imperial harem. Consort Zhen was born in 1876. She is best known as a consort of the Guangxu Emperor, the penultimate emperor of the Qing dynasty. Her elder sister, Consort Zhen, was also chosen to be a concubine, and both girls entered the Forbidden City when Zhen was just 13 years old. Unlike many concubines who faded into obscurity, Consort Zhen captured the attention and affection of Emperor Guangxu, in sharp contrast to the traditional and conservative imperial palace. Consort Zhen was a bubbly and free-spirited woman who enjoyed learning about new cultures and technology. Her effervescent personality deeply captured the favor of Emperor Guangxu, who would often spend his leisure time with her. Picture this young woman in the restrictive environment of the late Qing dynasty palace. While other concubines spent their days in traditional pursuits, embroidery, calligraphy, learning classical poetry, Consort Zhen was curious about the world beyond China's border. She read foreign newspapers when she could get them, asked questions about Western technology, and discussed politics and reform with anyone willing to engage. In a palace where women were expected to be decorative and silent, she was intelligent and outspoken. But in the harem, being loved by the emperor could be as dangerous as being ignored. Consort Zhen, commanding the emperor's sole attention along with her habit of breaking the rules, soon became a source of discontent for the powerful Empress Dowager. Consort Zhen knew about the emperor's well-meaning intentions to fix what was seen as an outdated imperial system, and often encouraged him to pursue his reforms. In 1894, Cixi degraded Consort Zhen, citing interference in political affairs as the main reason. According to some reports, she even had her flogged. Imagine being 24 years old, stripped naked and whipped by eunuchs on the orders of the Empress Dowager, because you encouraged your husband to modernize his country. The flogging wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation designed to break Consort Zhen's spirit and show every other woman in the palace what happened to those who stepped outside their assigned role. But Consort Zhen's true crime wasn't political interference. Her real offense was being young, intelligent, and loved by the emperor, while Cixi grew older and felt her grip slipping. In the harem system, women competed not just for imperial attention, but for survival itself. Cixi had clawed her way from low-ranking concubine to de facto ruler of China, and she wasn't about to let a younger, prettier, more progressive woman threaten her position. The end came during the chaos of 1900, when foreign armies occupied Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. As the imperial court fled the city, Empress Dowager Cixi made a final brutal decision about Consort Zhen. According to accounts, Cixi ordered Consort Zhen to be released from house arrest and brought before her. The empress allegedly said, I originally planned to bring you along with us, but you are young and pretty and are likely to be raped by the foreign soldiers on the way. I trust you know what you should do." This was the language of false mercy, the pretense of protection used to mask murder. Sikthi was ordering Consort Jen to commit suicide, framing it as concern for her safety and honor. But when Consort Jen refused to kill herself, and instead begged that the emperor be allowed to stay and negotiate with the foreign powers, Sikthi's mask of concern fell away. Thinking she was to be saved, Jen pleaded that the emperor be allowed to stay in the Forbidden City to attempt negotiations. In a state of fury, the empress ordered that Jen be thrown into the small well that remains today. Infuriated with her, Empress Dowager Sikthi finally ordered Consort Jen to be thrown into a well behind Ninggang Palace in the northeastern part of the Forbidden City. Picture that final confrontation between two women whose lives had been shaped by the same brutal system. Sikthi, now in her 60s, had survived decades in the harem by becoming more ruthless than anyone else. She had ordered the deaths of hundreds, maybe thousands of people to maintain her power. Consort Jen, 24 years old, still believed that reason and compassion could prevail. She was asking Sikthi to consider the good of the empire over personal survival. But Sikthi had long ago learned that in the harem system, compassion was weakness, and personal survival was the only truth that mattered. She had become the perfect product of the system that had victimized her, a woman who could order the murder of another woman without hesitation, who could justify any cruelty in the name of necessity. Jen's body wasn't recovered until the following year when she was eventually laid to rest. The well remains in the Forbidden City today, a small hole in the ground that tour guides point out as a curious historical footnote. But picture that moment, a 24-year-old woman being forced into a well barely wide enough for a human body, drowning in darkness, while the most powerful people in China fled to save themselves. Consort Jen's final moments would have been terrifying beyond imagination. Wells in the Forbidden City were deep and narrow, designed for water storage, not human disposal. She would have fallen perhaps 20 or 30 feet, likely breaking bones on impact with the stone walls or the bottom. If the fall didn't kill her immediately, she would have drowned slowly in the stagnant water, alone in complete darkness, knowing that no one was coming to save her. These individual stories of horror were enabled by a system that reached into every corner of Chinese society. Some Ming emperors had upwards of 9,000 concubines, many of whom had been kidnapped from their homes and were forbidden to leave their gilded prison except when they were called to the emperor's bed. Consider the mathematics of this system. If an emperor had 9,000 concubines and lived for 40 years after ascending the throne, he would need to see a different woman every night for 25 years, just to meet each one once. Many of them spent their entire lives in the palace without any contact with the emperor. They were prisoners who never even met their captor. Picture spending your entire life from age 14 until death, waiting for a summons that never comes. You wake up every morning wondering if today is the day you'll be chosen. You practice conversation topics, perfect your appearance, rehearse how you'll behave if called to the emperor's presence. Years pass, your hair begins to gray, your skin shows the first lines of age. Other women are chosen, some multiple times, while you remain invisible. You begin to understand that you will live and die in this palace, without ever speaking to the man whose property you are supposed to be. The psychological toll was immense. Many concubines spent their days waiting for a call from the emperor. During these long waits, they often felt cut off from the court's activities. This could lead to long days of loneliness for many women. Concubines had their own rooms and would fill their days applying makeup, sewing, practicing various arts, and socializing with other concubines. But even their interactions with each other were constrained by the rigid hierarchy. Any interactions among the women were guided by strict etiquette based on their positions in the ranking system. They had to show respect to those of higher status and be careful in their actions to avoid upsetting anyone or drawing unwanted notice from people in power who wanted to harm them. Imagine trying to form friendships in an environment where your friend's promotion could mean your demotion, where showing too much affection for someone could be interpreted as forming dangerous alliances, where every conversation is monitored by eunuchs who report back to higher authorities. The harem system deliberately prevented genuine relationships between women, knowing that isolated individuals were easier to control than communities of resistance. The women could form friendships and political alliances, but competition for the emperor's attention often interfered with many of these relationships. The system was designed to pit women against each other. If you became friends with another concubine, you were also competing with her for the emperor's limited attention. Your friend's success could mean your failure. Your failure could mean not just personal disappointment, but potentially physical punishment, demotion in rank, or even death. Some women found ways to survive psychologically within these constraints. They formed carefully balanced relationships that provided companionship without threatening the hierarchy. They developed elaborate codes for communication that allowed them to express genuine emotions while maintaining the required formality. They created art, music, and poetry that preserved their humanity despite the system's attempts to reduce them to objects. Others broke under the pressure. Palace records from various dynasties mention women who stopped eating, who spoke to imaginary people, who attacked themselves or others without apparent reason. The harem system produced madness as surely as it produced male heirs, but the madness was treated as a management problem rather than a human tragedy. To understand how the harem system perpetuated itself, we need to understand how it could transform its victims into perpetrators. Empress Dowager Cixi began as a low-ranking concubine, chosen as a concubine of the 5th rank, noble person or worthy lady in Chinese, and was given the name Lan, meaning orchid. But Cixi had what many concubines lacked. She gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son. In 1855, the Lady Yeonara, as Cixi's name was recorded upon entering the Forbidden City, became pregnant, and on April 27, 1856, she gave birth to Zai Chun, the only male heir of the Xianfeng emperor, obtaining an elevation to imperial consort Yi, a consort of the 4th rank. This single biological fact transformed her from prisoner to power broker. Picture Cixi as a young woman, probably 16 or 17 when she gave birth. She had been in the palace for a few years, had watched other women rise and fall in the emperor's favor, and had learned that the only security came from producing male children. When her son was born and survived his first year, infant mortality was high even for imperial children. She knew her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just another concubine. She was the mother of the heir to the throne. But even this elevation came with new danger. Just before the birth of the Tongji emperor, Cixi was nearly demoted in rank for her bad temper and insolence. The empress consort Zhen, also known as Empress Dowager Xian, intervened on her behalf. The empress could have let Cixi fall from grace and eliminated a potential rival. Instead, she protected her, beginning a complex relationship that would shape Chinese politics. When her husband died in 1861 AD, Cixi saw her opportunity. She viewed the emperor's death as a chance to strike a blow to improve China, believing the regents had poorly advised him. Then known as Consort Yi, she worked together with Empress Dowager Xian on a plan to launch a coup. The two women successfully overthrew the regents, imprisoning 5 of them, executing 1, and ordering 2 to commit suicide. Picture that moment of transformation. Cixi had been a victim of the harem system for years, powerless except for her role as the mother of the heir. Now suddenly she had the opportunity to seize control of the entire empire. The coup required careful planning, coordination with imperial relatives, and the willingness to order the deaths of powerful men who had been her superiors just days before. This was the moment when victim became perpetrator, when someone who had suffered under the system chose to perpetuate and strengthen it rather than reform it. Cixi could have used her new power to improve conditions for women in the harem, to limit the emperor's ability to collect thousands of concubines, to reform the selection process that tore girls from their families. Instead, she used the same tools of oppression that had controlled her to control others. For the next 47 years, until her death in 1908 AD, Cixi controlled the Chinese Empire. She had survived the harem system by mastering its cruelties and turned those same cruelties outward onto the empire and inward onto the next generation of palace women. Her treatment of her daughter-in-law revealed how the system perpetuated itself. When Emperor Tongji married Empress Alut, Cixi became jealous of their relationship. From the very beginning of his marriage, Tongji spent most of his time with his empress at the expense of his 4 concubines, including Lady Fucha, noble consort Gi, who had been chosen by Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi became hostile to the young empress and told them that they were both still young and should spend more time studying how to effectively manage the country. Cixi also used eunuchs to spy on Tongji. The young emperor was trying to build a normal marriage relationship with his wife, but Cixi couldn't tolerate losing control over him. She had spent years positioning herself as the power behind the throne, and a strong empress who influenced the emperor threatened that position. When Emperor Tongji married and his wife Alut gave birth to a baby boy, Empress Cixi, realizing that he was a threat to her power, ordered the baby killed. It was said that not long after, Emperor Tongji contracted smallpox and died. His wife, after her husband's death, committed suicide by swallowing opium. But there was a rumor that Empress Cixi might have been the one responsible for the young emperor and his wife's death. The woman who had once been a powerless concubine had become the architect of the system's continuation. She killed her own grandson to maintain power. She drove her daughter-in-law to suicide rather than share influence. She had learned the lessons of the harem too well. Trust no one. Eliminate threats before they become dangerous, and never show mercy to anyone who might challenge your position. Throughout Chinese history, millions of women disappeared into the imperial harem system. During peak periods, more than 20,000 women were living in the palace during the reigns of Emperor Huan and Emperor Ling. Each number represents a life that was cut short, dreams that were never realized, families that were torn apart. Picture a single day in such a massive harem. 20,000 women waking up in buildings spread across hundreds of acres. The sound of silk rustling as they dress, the murmur of thousands of conversations in dozens of dialects, the scratch of brushes on paper as they practice calligraphy, the soft notes of musical instruments as they rehearse songs they may never perform for their intended audience, the smell of incense, perfume, and food cooking in massive kitchens to feed this small city of women. The complex choreography of servants and eunuchs, moving between buildings, carrying messages, supplies, and reports on behavior and health. But beneath this surface of civilized activity ran currents of desperation, competition, and fear. Women calculating which other women posed threats to their position. Eunuchs watching for signs of inappropriate relationships or political discussions. Guards ensuring that none of these women ever approached the boundaries of their gilded prison. Medical examinations to track menstrual cycles and fertility. The constant awareness that your life could change or end based on decisions made by people you would never meet. About concerns you would never understand. But the cost extended beyond the palace wall. Many concubines met a sad fate when their emperor died. They were sacrificed, often buried alive, to join their master in the afterlife. When emperors died, hundreds or thousands of women who had never chosen to enter the palace were forced to follow them into death. Picture the scene when an emperor died and the order went out for his concubines to join him in death. Women who had spent years waiting for a summons that never came suddenly received their final command. Some were told they would be buried alive in the emperor's tomb, others that they would be hanged or forced to drink poison. The lucky ones might be allowed to commit suicide in their own chambers rather than face public execution. Imagine being a 20-year-old concubine who entered the palace at 14, spent 6 years waiting for the emperor to notice her, and now learns that her reward for loyalty is death. She's never been allowed outside the palace walls, never kissed anyone, never had a child, never learned a trade or skill that could support her in the outside world. Her entire adult life has been spent in preparation for a moment that never arrived. And now she's being told that her purpose was always to die when the emperor died. The system also created a culture of violence that extended throughout Chinese society. The casual brutality of the harem, the beatings, the executions, the disposal of human beings like objects, became normalized at the highest levels of power. This normalization trickled down through every level of society, creating a culture where violence against women was not just accepted but expected. Consider the story of Emperor Zheng, the 10th Ming ruler, Zheng, who ascended in 1505, grew tired of concubines and was obsessed with the life of an ordinary citizen. He would slip out in the night in disguise and frequent local brothels. However, this did not stop him from collecting so many concubines that it is said, many starved to death as there was not enough food to feed them or room to house them. Think about that casual mention. Many starved to death as there was not enough food to feed them. These weren't numbers on a ledger or abstract statistics. These were individual women with names, histories, and families who had been kidnapped from their homes and brought to the palace, where they died slowly of hunger because the emperor collected more women than he could afford to keep alive. Picture one of those women in her final days. She's 18, has been in the palace for 3 years. She started healthy and hopeful, believing that palace life, however restricted, would at least mean regular meals and shelter. Now she's weak from malnutrition, her silk robes hanging loose on her shrinking frame. She can hear other women in nearby chambers crying from hunger. The food rations have been cut again because the emperor has brought in another 100 women and there isn't enough to go around. She lies on her silk bed, too weak to stand, listening to her stomach cramping, wondering if anyone will even notice when she dies. The emperor, meanwhile, is sneaking out of the palace to visit brothels because his own harem of thousands of women has become boring to him. The contrast is staggering. Women dying of starvation inside the palace while the man who collected them seeks variety in the streets of Beijing. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the logical endpoint of a system that treated women as collectible objects, rather than human beings. Many historians claim that it was Zhenda's rule that led to the downfall of the Ming dynasty. His successor, Jia Jing, was obsessed with finding an elixir to provide him with eternal life, and he believed the key ingredient in this elixir to be the menstrual blood of virgins. The empire's resources were increasingly diverted from governance, defense, and public welfare toward the personal obsessions of emperors who viewed their subjects as raw materials for their projects. Within this system of horror, women developed complex strategies for survival. Some, like Empress Dowager Cixi, learned to manipulate the system's hierarchies and eventually gained power themselves. Others, like Consort Zhen, tried to maintain their humanity and individuality, often at the cost of their lives. Many simply endure. The women could form friendships and political alliances, but competition for the emperor's attention often interfered with many of these relationships. In a system designed to pit women against each other for scraps of male attention, genuine friendship became both a necessity for psychological survival and a potential weakness that could be exploited. Some women found ways to preserve pieces of their original self. Despite the system's attempts to erase their individuality, they secretly maintained religious practices from their home regions, taught other women dialects and songs from their villages, and preserved family recipes by sharing them in whispered conversation. These small acts of cultural preservation were forms of resistance, ways of maintaining connection to the people and places they had been forced to abandon. Others chose more direct forms of resistance. Beyond the famous assassination attempt on Emperor Jia Jing, palace records hint at numerous smaller acts of defiance. Women who refused to eat when summoned by the emperor, who damaged their own appearance to make themselves less desirable, who spread rumors or shared information that undermined palace security. These acts rarely resulted in freedom, but they allowed women to maintain some sense of agency in a system designed to render them completely powerless. The psychological damage of the harem system extended far beyond the palace wall. These women were typically the daughters of noble families, raised with expectations of marriage, children, and a role in society. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a world where their primary value was their potential to produce male heirs for a man they might never meet. Picture a 15-year-old girl from a wealthy merchant family in Guangzhou. She's been educated in literature and music, expected to marry the son of another merchant family, to help manage a household and raise children who would know their grandparents, and grow up surrounded by extended family. Instead, she's selected for the Imperial Harem and transported to Beijing, where she will spend the rest of her life surrounded by strangers, never again speaking to people who knew her family, never again tasting the regional foods of her childhood, or hearing the particular dialect of her hometown. The loss of identity was systematic and deliberate. Women selected for the harem were given new names, new clothes, new roles that had nothing to do with their previous lives. They were taught to speak in the Beijing dialect, to prefer Beijing cuisine, to worship in the imperial style rather than their family tradition. The goal was to erase everything that connected them to their previous identities, and replace it with complete loyalty to the emperor and the harem system. The few who did gain the emperor's attention faced different but equally severe psychological challenges: constant surveillance, the knowledge that any word or action could lead to punishment or death, the pressure to produce sons, the jealousy of hundreds of other women. These created a psychological environment that would break most people. Consider the experience of being chosen by the emperor after years of waiting. You're finally summoned to the dragon bed, the moment you've been preparing for since you entered the palace. But instead of romance or even simple human connection, you find a man who sees you as a combination of sexual object and breeding animal. You perform your duties hoping to conceive a son, knowing that pregnancy might elevate your status, but that giving birth to a daughter could result in punishment or death. If you do become pregnant, the next 9 months are spent under even more intense scrutiny. Court physicians monitor your diet, your activities, your emotional state. Other concubines watch for signs of favor or disfavor. Eunuchs report on your every word and gesture. You're no longer even a person. You're a vessel carrying a potential heir, valuable only for what might emerge from your body. The imperial harem system finally ended with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. The practice of concubinage in China was outlawed when the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949. But even today, echoes of the system persist in modern China's treatment of women, and in cultures around the world where women's value is still measured primarily by their relationships to men. The last emperor, Puyi, was just a child when the system ended. His adoptive mothers, the surviving concubines of previous emperors, tried to maintain the old traditions in miniature. Lady Tatara and dowager imperial noble consort Zhengyi had an argument over who should be the empress. Consort Wenjing favored Wan, while Zhengyi and Puyi himself preferred Wanshou. In Lady Tatara's opinion, Wanshou was not beautiful enough to be empress, and she came from a lesser family background compared to Wan. Even in their reduced circumstances, even when the empire had fallen and the system had officially ended, these women continued the patterns of judgment and competition that had defined their lives. They were still evaluating other women's worth based on beauty and family background, still competing for influence over a male figure, still perpetuating the very system that had oppressed them. This reveals something crucial about how systems of oppression survive. They don't just control their victims, they teach their victims to perpetuate the system, even when the original structure of power has collapsed. Lady Tatara had spent her entire adult life in the harem system. She had no other model for how relationships between women should work, no other framework for understanding value and hierarchy. When given the chance to break free from those patterns, she instead recreated them on a smaller scale. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the imperial harem system is how thoroughly it has been romanticized in modern culture. Emperors' concubines and harems are emphasized in 21st century romantic novels, written for female readers and set in ancient times. Television dramas and movies portray harem life as glamorous, full of beautiful costumes and palace intrigue, focusing on romance rather than the systematic abuse of millions of women. Walk into any bookstore in China, Korea, or Japan, and you'll find shelves of novels about clever concubines who win the emperor's love through wit and beauty. Turn on the television and you'll see lavishly produced dramas where actresses in gorgeous silk gowns compete for imperial affection through elaborate schemes and passionate declarations. These stories focus on the rare women who gained power within the system, while ignoring the millions who suffered and died in silence. This romanticization serves to erase the real experiences of real women. When we focus on the occasional woman who gained power within the system, we ignore the millions who suffered and died in silence. When we emphasize the luxury and beauty of palace life, we ignore the foot binding, the forced menstruation harvesting, the drownings in wells, the deaths by 1,000 cuts. The historical records themselves were written by men for men, and they minimize women's suffering while emphasizing male power and achievement. Many of the specific details about women's experiences in the harem have been lost because they were never considered important enough to record in detail. We know the names of emperors and their political achievements, but we don't know the names of most of the women who died to support their power. What we do know comes from fragments: a court record mentioning an execution, a diary entry by a foreign visitor, a poem written by a concubine and preserved by accident. These fragments paint a picture of systematic horror, but they're just hints of a larger reality that was deliberately obscured by those in power. While the Chinese Imperial Harem system ended over a century ago, similar systems of systematic abuse continue around the world today. They're hidden better, structured differently, but the core elements remain: the reduction of women to sexual objects, the use of hierarchical systems to pit women against each other, the normalization of violence against women, and the concentration of power in the hands of men who face no consequences for their actions. Understanding the Imperial Harem system isn't just about understanding Chinese history. It's about understanding how systems of oppression function, how they perpetuate themselves across generations, and how they shape entire culture. The women who died in the Forbidden City died for the same reasons women die today, because societies that reduce women to objects make it easy to dispose of them when they become inconvenient. Consider modern trafficking networks that move women across international borders for sexual exploitation. The methods are different, but the underlying structure is similar: women isolated from their families and support networks, controlled through violence and surveillance, forced to compete with each other for marginally better treatment, their lives considered disposable by the men who profit from their exploitation. Or consider corporate cultures, where women are valued primarily for their appearance and their ability to please male executives, where they're encouraged to compete with each other for promotions rather than organize for better conditions, where complaints about harassment or discrimination are met with retaliation rather than reform. The specific mechanisms of control change, but the underlying patterns remain consistent across cultures and centuries. Isolate women from sources of external support, create hierarchies that reward collaboration with oppression, normalize violence as a tool of discipline, and ensure that those in power face no consequences for their abuse. In the end, what strikes me most about the Chinese Imperial Harem system is not its scale or its cruelty, but the courage of the women who resisted it. The 16 women who tried to strangle Emperor Zhang knew they were choosing death, but they chose it anyway. Consort Zhen could have submitted to Empress Dowager Cixi's demands for silence, but she chose to speak truth to power even when she knew the cost. These women deserve to be remembered, not as romantic figures in palace dramas, but as real people who faced impossible choices with courage. They deserve to have their suffering acknowledged, not minimized or ignored. They deserve to have their stories told truthfully, not filtered through modern sensibilities that make their reality more palatable. The courage required for their resistance is almost incomprehensible. When the 16 palace women decided to assassinate Emperor Zhang, they knew that failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the torture and execution of their family. They knew that success would likely mean their deaths as well. Palace coups rarely spared the assassins, even successful ones. Yet they chose to act anyway, because they had reached a point where continued existence under the current conditions was worse than certain death. Think about what it takes to reach that point. What level of daily horror, what accumulation of witnessed atrocities, what depth of personal violation would drive someone to choose certain torture and death over continued life. These women weren't making an impulsive decision in a moment of anger. They planned their assassination attempt for weeks or months, which means they spent weeks or months living with the knowledge that they were choosing death, while still enduring the conditions that made death preferable to life. Consort Zhen's courage was different but equally remarkable. She had survived in the harem system long enough to become the emperor's favorite concubine. She had achieved the highest status possible for a woman in that system, short of becoming emperor. She could have protected that position by staying silent about politics, by focusing on her personal relationship with the emperor, rather than encouraging his reform effort. Instead, she chose to use her influence to support changes that would benefit the empire, even though she knew it made her a target for Empress Dowager. When Cixi ordered her to commit suicide, Consort Zhen refused and instead used her final moments of life to advocate for the emperor staying in Beijing, to negotiate with foreign powers. Even facing death, she chose to think about the good of the country rather than her own survival. That kind of moral courage is extraordinary under any circumstances, but it's particularly remarkable coming from someone who had been raised in a system designed to crush moral reasoning and replace it with total obedience. Walk through the Forbidden City today and you'll see tourists taking selfies in the courtyards where women were tortured to death. You'll see gift shops selling romantic novels about harem intrigue. You'll hear guides talking about the architectural achievements and artistic treasure. But if you know where to look, you can still see the well where Consort Zhen drowned. You can see the walls that imprisoned thousands of women. You can see the chambers where children were killed for their blood. The buildings are beautiful, but they're also monuments to systematic horror that lasted for over 2,000 years. The well where Consort Zhen died is still there, covered with a stone slab marked with a small plaque that identifies it as a historical site. Tour groups pause there for a few minutes while guides explain the basic facts. A concubine was thrown into this well in night. Then they move on to admire the architecture of the next building. The tourists take pictures and comment on how small the well opening is, how impossible it would be to survive falling into it. What they don't discuss is what Consort Zhen's final moments were like. They don't imagine her hands scraping against the stone walls as she fell, her last glimpse of sky before the water closed over her head, the knowledge that she was dying because she had refused to be silent. They don't consider that this small hole in the ground was someone's entire world for the last minutes of her life, that a human being died here in terror and darkness because she believed that truth was more important than survival. The buildings of the Forbidden City are preserved as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, protected for their architectural and historical significance. But there's no equivalent protection for the memory of the women who suffered and died within those buildings. Their stories are footnotes, curiosities, romantic plot devices rather than historical realities that deserve serious engagement and remembrance. The darkest secret of the Chinese Imperial Harem wasn't any single act of cruelty. It was how completely the system convinced society that this was normal, natural, even beautiful. Women's suffering became entertainment. Their deaths became footnotes. Their lives became decorative elements in the story of male power. This normalization was perhaps the system's greatest achievement and its most insidious legacy. When horror becomes routine, when violence becomes expected, when human suffering is treated as the natural cost of maintaining power, entire societies become complicit in maintaining systems of oppression. The imperial harem system required the cooperation of millions of people beyond the emperor and his immediate court. Parents had to surrender their daughters to imperial selection processes. Local officials had to organize and oversee those selection processes. Merchants had to supply the silk and food and luxury goods that kept the harems functioning. Guards had to enforce the boundaries that kept women imprisoned. Servants had to carry out the daily tasks of surveillance and control. Doctors had to examine women's bodies and certify their fitness for imperial use. Artists had to create the romantic paintings and poems that made the system seem beautiful rather than horrific. Each of these roles required people to participate in systematic abuse, while telling themselves that they were serving a higher purpose: imperial glory, cultural tradition, political stability, economic prosperity. The system worked because it provided everyone involved with a rationale for their participation that allowed them to avoid confronting the human cost of their action. This is how systems of oppression maintain themselves across generations, not through the actions of a few obvious villains, but through the complicity of ordinary people who find ways to justify their participation in systems they know cause suffering. The harem system survived for over 2,000 years because millions of people chose to maintain it rather than resist it. Today, when we tell stories about the imperial harem, we have a choice. We can continue the romanticization that serves to hide the truth, or we can honor the women who suffered by telling their stories truthfully. We can acknowledge that beauty and horror can exist in the same space, that architectural marvels can also be monuments to human suffering. The 16 women who tried to kill Emperor Jade on that night in 1542 AD knew they were fighting not just against one man, but against a system. They lost that fight, but their courage echoes across the century. Consort Jane knew that speaking truth about reform would cost her everything, but she spoke anyway. Her voice was silenced in a well, but the fact that she used it at all is a testament to human dignity in the face of impossible circumstance. These women couldn't escape the forbidden city in life, but their stories can escape the limited ways we've chosen to remember them. They deserve better than to be reduced to romantic fantasies or historical footnotes. They deserve to be remembered as they were, human beings who faced systematic horror with whatever courage they could muster, and who in their resistance proved that even the most complete systems of control cannot entirely crush the human spirit. The walls of the Forbidden City still stand red and gold under the Beijing sun. Millions of tourists visit each year to admire their beauty and learn about China's imperial history. But the women who once lived behind those walls, who died behind those walls, who chose resistance even when it meant certain death, their stories are finally free to be told without the filters of romance and political convenience that have obscured them for centuries. Every time someone tells the true story of the imperial harem, the foot-binding and blood harvesting, the assassination attempts and drowning, the courage and the horror and the systematic dehumanization of millions of women, those 16 women who tried to strangle Emperor Jade achieve a small victory. Every time someone refuses to romanticize palace life, and instead honors the reality of women's experiences, Consort Jane's voice echoes once more from that well in the Forbidden City. Their resistance lives on in our refusal to forget, in our insistence on truth over comfort, in our recognition that the courage of women facing impossible circumstances deserves to be remembered and honored rather than hidden behind beautiful lies. The empire that enslaved them is gone, but their courage remains a testament to the power of human dignity, even in the face of absolute oppression.